was only mid-afternoon, but still this strange, dense darkness seemed to cover the entire countryside. And in fact, it was so dark, so dense that you could almost feel the darkness around you. But not all was in darkness. On a few hills and mountains that surrounded the valley, there were little enclaves. There were gatherings of men, women, and children who were playing and praying and singing together. And some light from some unseen source just seemed to be lighting up these little groups and pushing the darkness away. As you look at the faces of those who were there playing and praying and singing together, you could see looks of love, looks of adoration on their faces, mixed with looks of expectancy and hope. But that's not what it was like down in the valley below. Down in the valley, the earth was moving and convulsing back and forth as if it were waves on an ocean. Fault lines were beginning to crack wide open, and some of the earth, some of the sediment was now beginning to be blown away by the gusting wind. The lightning storm in the sky was becoming so fierce that it literally was beginning to look like a ring of fire encircled the earth. And the accompanying claps of thunder were so loud, they were absolutely deafening. But up in one of those gatherings of men, women, and children, one little girl was sitting looking up intently at the sky. No one was sure what she was looking for, but she was not diverting her gaze, just fixed. And suddenly, she jumped to her feet and said, "Look, look!" And as everyone turned and looked in the direction that she was pointing, off there on the eastern horizon, they just began to make out something. And in spite of the darkness, in spite of the lightning, they began to make out this luminous cloud about the size of a man's hand. And as their eyes stayed transfixed on that cloud, as that cloud grew nearer and nearer, it grew bigger and it grew brighter, until soon it was enveloping the entire sky. And as they were looking up at that cloud, suddenly they began to see and recognize that this cloud was literally filled with angelic beings. And all of the angels in that cloud were looking in one direction. And those who were looking up at the cloud found themselves drawn in that direction as well. Everyone now looking at the one who sat in the center of the cloud. And there was no mistaking who this was. This was Jesus sitting in the center of the cloud. There was a smile on his face from ear to ear. There was a twinkle in his eye. His arms were open wide as if inviting you into a big, loving embrace. As he held his arms out wide, the brilliance of that cloud seemed to highlight those scars on either wrist, those scars from those Roman spikes that had been nailed into his wrist, that had nailed him to the cross. And as those who were looking up at Jesus saw those reminders of what Jesus had done for them, in that moment, a flush of unworthiness came over all of them as they fell to the ground, and they wondered, could it be true? Does Jesus really love me? Is Jesus' grace really sufficient for me? But they didn't have to wait long, because they could hear the voice of the one sitting in the middle of the crowd saying, "I love you. I love you so much." And as those words of love echoed in their ears, the angels there in the cloud burst into singing. But over the top of the voices of that angelic choir, 10,000s upon 10,000s of angels, above all of their voices, echoed out the voice of Jesus, "Awake, awake, those who sleep in the earth, awake." And while those words still echoed in the air, suddenly tombs and mausoleums and vaults began to burst open, and those who were once dead stepped out of those tombs, stepped out of those vaults, stepped out of those mausoleums. And now those who were there, who had been looking up at that cloud, suddenly found themselves surrounded by friends, by family, by loved ones who they had not seen in years. And suddenly, in that moment of grand reunion, they felt a weightlessness coming over their body as their feet began to lift from the ground. And they found themselves caught up into that cloud with Jesus for a celestial space trip to the home that he had prepared for them in heaven. For those of you here who have grown up in a Seventh-day Adventist home or a Seventh-day Adventist context, you know the story that I'm talking about here. You've heard the story. It is the great hope of the church that this world is not our home. There is something else. There is something better than this sinful world of injustice in which we live. That one day, the great hope of the church is that Jesus is going to come a second time. A second time, because the first time that Jesus came was when he came to die for our sins. But the second time is when he comes to take us to that place called heaven, to where he has prepared a place for each of us. And it's apropos that we start with this story today, because as we continue on in our journey through the book of Mark, we are today in Mark, the 13th chapter. And Mark, the 13th chapter, is all about the second coming of Jesus Christ. As the story begins in Mark, the 13th chapter, Jesus is now withdrawn from the city of Jerusalem. Jesus is now sitting on the green grass in an olive grove there on the Mount of Olives. He's surrounded by all of his disciples, and as they sit there, they can look in between the olive trees and see the outline of the city of Jerusalem, the holy city of Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount and all of its beauty, all of its glory. Jesus sits there quietly, but he can sense that there is an air of excitement building with his disciples. You see, this has been an incredible week so far, and the week's not even over, but it's been an incredible week for Jesus and his disciples. They've watched, they've seen as Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, to the cheers and the adulation of the crowd. They were there. They watched as Jesus openly challenged not only the temple and the authority of the temple, but also as he challenged the authority of the priestly caste by demanding that they no longer have a temple based on walls of exclusivity, but they have a temple based on tearing down all walls, a temple of inclusivity. And they were there when Jesus, for the first time, has now publicly announced his identity to the crowd. You see, up to this point in the book of Mark, Jesus has never publicly said to the crowd who he is. In fact, when demons have recognized that they are standing in the presence of God in the form of Jesus, have called out his name, have identified, he's hushed them up. For 3.5 years, he has kept secret to everyone except his disciples his true identity. But now he's revealed it for the first time publicly, because he has said, I am not a son of David. I'm not a flesh and bone son of David. Because look in the very writings of David. David doesn't refer to me as his son, but he refers to me as his Lord. And now Jesus has announced publicly to everybody, I am not just born of a woman, but I am literally God himself in flesh and bone. And all of these events have led the disciples to one clear conclusion. This is it. This is the moment where Jesus is going to bring an end to this world of injustice. Jesus is going to bring an end to this sinful world in which we live, and he's going to start his reign. He's going to build up his kingdom of righteousness in the ashes of that which he tears down. And so they gather around Jesus, wondering if now is the moment when Jesus is going to set up his kingdom. So if you have your Bibles with you in whatever form, take them out. Turn with me to the book of Mark, the 13th chapter. The book of Mark, we're now at the 13th chapter. And there in the book of Mark, the 13th chapter, we'll begin reading in verse number 4. Mark, the 13th chapter, beginning in verse number 4, says this. The disciples then said to Jesus, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" Jesus' disciples say, "Look, we sense this getting close, but tell us, give us a chronological layout of what's going to take place so that we know when this happens, this happens, this happens, and this happens, then your kingdom is going to be established." And so Jesus responds there in verse 5 to his disciples. And Jesus answered them, began to say, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will deceive many." And I can picture the disciples right now. They're taking out little pieces of pottery that they would have written on in that time, or maybe unfurling a scroll. They've got out their writing utensil because they're going to take note, because they want to know everything that's going to happen leading up to Jesus establishing his kingdom. They want to have it all charted out. Now, again, for those of you that are here today that have grown up in a Seventh-day Adventist context, you know what chart or type of chart the disciples were thinking about. They were thinking about a chart that looks something like this. Have you seen that chart? Now, no one panic today. I'm not going to try to go through this chart today because you'd miss lunch if I did that. All right? But you know this chart, but I know this too about this chart. I know that this chart causes us to lose our focus. Because when we have charts like this, what we begin to do is this. We begin to focus on the events themselves. Jesus, we don't have to worry about yet. He's going to come. He's going to establish his kingdom somewhere way down there in the unforeseen future. So we're going to pay attention to world events. Oh, what does that war mean? Oh, what does that famine mean? Oh, what does that natural disaster mean? But notice, all of our attention is focused not on Jesus, but on things. And so Jesus' disciples sit there eagerly, ready to make their own charts. And so Jesus continues, verse number 7. Jesus says, "But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." And I can see Jesus' disciples scribbling it down. Okay, we've got it. When we see wars, and then we see rumors of wars, and then we see nation against nation, then we can start focusing on you. And Jesus recognizes very quickly that his disciples have got their focus in all the wrong places. But he continues. Second half of verse 8. "And there will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows." And I can again see the disciples. Yeah, they're building their chart. Wars first, rumors of wars. That's kind of interesting. Switch. Wars, then rumors of wars. Then the nation against nation. Then there's going to be natural disasters, then there's going to be famine, and once we've seen all of these, then now we can focus on Jesus. But I want you to see what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is not laying out world events as a map, as a chart, so we can get consumed with the chart and consumed with the things and keep our focus there and not our focus on Jesus. In reality, Jesus is giving things that are not unique signs in and of themselves. When has there been a time in the 6,000, 7,000, whatever thousand you want to put it? When has there been a time, at least a time after Genesis chapter 3 in the fall, when has there been a time in the history of this world that there have not been wars, rumors of wars, famines, and natural disasters? Tragically, all of these things happen too often on a daily basis. And Jesus says the danger is that we become obsessed about the things and we lose our focus on Jesus. You know, we begin to say things like, wow, what does that war mean? Or, wow, what's God telling me in that natural disaster? What all of that is telling you is simply this: we live in a sinful, evil, unjust world. And so I don't want my attention to be on the things of this world. I want my attention to be on Jesus. And Jesus then completes this sermon, his only sermon that he preaches about quote unquote last day events, his only sermon he preaches about his second coming. He ends it with these words, starting in verse 32. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even our charts know. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Therefore, says Jesus, take heed, watch and pray, for you do not know when the time is. It's like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch, therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he finds you sleeping. So Jesus says, look, I want to focus you where your focus needs to be. And where your focus needs to be is not on world events, but your focus needs to be on watching. But watching for what? What is Jesus saying when he says that we need to always be watching? Well, this same last day event sermon of Jesus has a parallel account of it found in Matthew, the 24th chapter. And following Jesus' sermon, the exact one here verbatim that he gives in Mark 30, he ends with three parables in Matthew 25. Three parables that testify to what it really means to be a watcher for Jesus. And it all culminates in his final grand climax parable of what it really means to watch for Jesus. And by the way, what it really means to be an Adventist. For those of us that have our membership in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we know what the seventh stands for. That's why we're here today. We believe that God created this day for a day for us to come together and fellowship and enjoy each other's company, but also enjoy the intimate company of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But what does it truly mean to be Adventist? Is Adventist defined by, well, I've got this vague hope that sometime in some undetermined moment, Jesus will come, but I don't spend much time focused on Jesus because I'm focused on all of these events, all of these things. Jesus takes us to the heart of what it means to be an Adventist. Jesus takes us to the heart of what it means to be a watcher for Jesus in the book of Matthew, the 25th chapter. Beginning in verse number 33, it says this: "And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, 'Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world.'" Do you want to be right or left? Right. "For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will say to Jesus, "When? When did we do all of this?" To which Jesus will respond in verse number 40. And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly, I say to you, insomuch as you have done it to one of the least of these, my brethren, so you did it to who? To me. Do you hear what Jesus is saying here? You hear what Jesus is saying, what it really means to be a watcher for Jesus? What you're really watching for? We spent some time today in our worship service talking about who is Jesus. Well, this parable holds out very clearly to us at least a part of who Jesus is. Because you see, Jesus is that young boy, that young girl here in this community, that when they have lunch at school on Friday and then head home for the weekend, have no idea if there will be any food that they will have at home that they can eat from the time they've had lunch on Friday to the time they return to school on Monday to have a meal provided for them. See, Jesus is that boy. Jesus is that girl. In fact, Jesus is every one of the children in 1 in 6 families in America, not in Sudan, not in other parts of the world. But Jesus is every one of those boys and girls in 1 in 6 families in America who suffer from food insecurity, meaning they never know exactly where their next meal is going to come from, or if there is going to be a next meal. Jesus is them. Jesus is that refugee man, that refugee woman, that refugee child. Jesus is the 60 million displaced people in the world today, 41% of those children. Jesus is every one of those men, women, and children. He's every one. Jesus is that homeless man or woman that stands there holding up their sign, that have only the clothes that they have on their backs, as ragged as they are, and have no place to seek shelter from the heat or from the cold. Jesus is every one of them. Jesus is that person who is sick and has no availability of medical care and no one to take care of them. Jesus is every one of them. Jesus is that prisoner who's been thrown behind a locked cell and left there to rot. Jesus is every one of them. Jesus is every teen and young adult in the LGBTQ plus community who have been unceremoniously kicked to the curb by the people that should have loved him and nurtured him most, their parents. Jesus is every one of those boys, those girls, those young men, those young women. Jesus is all of them. In fact, Jesus is everyone that he puts into our path on any given day that's in need. That is literally Jesus paying us a visit. And here's the ironic thing. If I catch on to this, if I begin to say, Jesus, help me to be aware of when you put me in the path of where you are today, and when I begin to see people in need as literally Jesus, and I begin to respond to their needs, here's the ironic twist. Suddenly, in that moment in time, I become the Jesus that they most desperately needed at that moment, at that time. They come to me as Jesus, and I minister to them as Jesus. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out one other thing that's here, or not here, I should say, within this parable of the sheep and the goats. There's a film that my family and we've watched probably ad nauseum amounts of time. None of you have probably ever heard of it. I don't think it ever had a theater release, but it's just a powerful film. At least it touches me at a deep level, called The Second Chance. And in this movie, it shows a pastor of an inner city church who has come to the big mother church, the big mega suburban church that sponsors their ministry. It's again time to ask for money. But instead of asking for money, he asked to rather blank faces with their arms crossed. He says, what I really need is we have some exceptional kids that need tutors in the inner city. I'd love you to come down and be a tutor for one of those kids. We have women with young children that are trying to escape from the bondage of prostitution that need people that will come down and be mentors to them. And still, you could have heard a cricket chirping in the congregation, arms folded, heads and minds oblivious to what's being said. And so he tells them this story. He said, on the way to church today, there was a woman holding a baby, tapping on the window of my car. And he said, I knew the baby wasn't real. I knew it was a plastic doll that she had wrapped up in a blanket, but she just kept tapping. And so he said, finally, I did the only thing that I could do in that moment. After all, I needed to be somewhere. He said, I rolled down my window and I threw her some cash so that she would just leave me alone. And he said, that's the reality in the church and in the U.S. So oftentimes when we hear people tapping on the windows of our car, we find it easier to just roll down the window and throw them some green so that they won't bother us anymore. But I find it hard to believe that if we saw Jesus in the flesh, tapping on our car window, I'd at least like to believe that we wouldn't just roll down our window and throw some green to Jesus, hoping that he would then leave us alone. But here's the reality. Every time we are brought into the path of someone in need, we are standing in the presence of Jesus. And as we minister to their needs, we become the Jesus that they need in that moment. Oh, would it be that would it be that would it be that us, that we would come to the place where every day we're asking ourselves, Jesus, how are you going to show up today? Every week we're wondering, how is Jesus and who is Jesus going to show up to me today? And then as we minister to the Jesus that are brought into our life, we can then become the Jesus that they need in their life. And would it be that someday you and I, that we would hear these words, sweet words, spoken from the lips of Jesus, as surely as you have done it into one of the least of these my children, you have done it unto me.